Thanks for joining me for the Drip Irrigation Basics webinar. Okay, so I just want to do a quick introduction. That way we know who's behind the presentation after I turn my video off. But my name is Lance Ackerman. I'm a water conservation specialist here at Colorado Springs Utilities, and one of my main responsibilities is helping customers be successful with their landscapes while using that water wisely. I have a degree in landscape horticulture with a concentration in landscape design and contracting from Colorado State University. I have 10 plus years of experience in the industry. I specialize in irrigation, installation, and efficiency practices. I have certifications from the Irrigation Association, a certified irrigation technician, as well as a certified landscape irrigation auditor. And I am native to Colorado, and in fact, I'm native to Colorado Springs. So I have a little bit of a background in landscaping here in our climate. So the agenda tonight, what we're going to cover is what drip irrigation really is. So we'll be discussing kind of just the difference between drip irrigation and what the traditional irrigation is, overhead irrigation. We'll discuss some of those benefits. We'll talk about situations and scenarios where to use drip irrigation. And we'll also talk about some areas where drip irrigation is not recommended. We'll cover some drip irrigation equipment. We'll talk about how to connect drip to a water source. And we'll talk also about drip irrigation scheduling. Within the drip, connecting drip to a water source, we'll also kind of touch upon some of the basics of drip irrigation design. So let's go ahead and start with what is drip irrigation? So the picture on the right over here, this is our traditional overhead sprinklers, and this here is drip irrigation. Traditional overhead sprinklers, the water or the precipitation rate or the water output is measured in gallons per minute. Drip irrigation is measured in gallons per hour. So that's an indication of a lower volume of water being distributed here in the drip irrigation. One of the major differences between drip irrigation and overhead sprinklers is drip irrigation is just below the mulch and on top of the soil surface. Drip irrigation provides water directly to the base of the plant. So that's what we call point source drip irrigation. Drip irrigation, another term you'll hear is emitters, and those are what is punctured directly into the side of the pipe. It's this red device here that controls how much and how quickly that water is applied to the intended area. So one of the main differences is we're kind of drip irrigation, we're watering to an intended area or to a specific area, whereas overhead irrigation is kind of saturating that entire area for that plant. So just quickly, I wanted to talk about the two types of drip irrigation. And you kind of heard me refer to it here in that first slide of what the difference between drip irrigation and overhead irrigation. But the two types are point source irrigation. Here's an example of point source, so meaning we have our emitters and we're applying water directly to the base of that plant. And the other type is called inline drip irrigation. So here is an example of inline drip irrigation, where generally the inline drip irrigation is installed in some sort of grid-like pattern, and it's used for a more densely planted planting bed or a vegetable garden. So just quickly wanted to cover those two types because you'll hear me talk about them as we progress through the webinar tonight. So the benefits of drip irrigation is it's much more efficient. So drip irrigation is 90 to 95% efficient versus overhead irrigation generally is 60 to 65% efficient. Meaning overhead irrigation, 30 to 35% of that water is not being put to beneficial use, meaning we're losing it either through runoff, oversaturation, some of that's lost through evaporation or wind drift, versus drip irrigation is 90 to 95% efficient, and that 5 to 10% is only lost through evaporation. So we're not having to have that concern about runoff or oversaturation. Drip irrigation can be really efficient, 90 to 95%, but it's only as efficient as the management of that irrigation system. So you want to make sure that you have it scheduled appropriately and you're not overwatering. One of the main benefits of drip irrigation is the maintenance is much easier, because we learned that drip irrigation is generally just below the mulch and on top of the surface, versus overhead irrigation. That lateral line or that irrigation pipe is generally buried 6 or more inches below the soil surface. You can have plants with varying water needs on the same zone. And that's especially true with point source, because you can select emitters to apply different amounts of water to each plant based upon those plant water needs. So there's less water waste from runoff or misaligned sprinklers. So overhead irrigation, generally, we've all seen it where that sprinkler head is spraying into the street or spraying into the driveway. So we don't have that concern with the drip irrigation. And drip irrigation is not currently subject to our time of day water-wise rules. So overhead irrigation, it's recommended to have that irrigation occur prior to 10 a.m. or after 6 p.m. But with drip irrigation, since it's so efficient, we're not throwing that water into the air, we're having that wind drift or that evaporation, drip irrigation can be ran at any time during the day. So now I'll talk about some areas of where to use drip irrigation. So it's really useful in landscape renovations. So this picture on the right here is traditional space between two houses. This is kind of what we call a stupid turf area. But what this means is this lawn is not being put to beneficial use. It's a high water intensive lawn. The likelihood of that lawn being used for its intended purpose is slim to none. The only time they're walking on that lawn is when they're mowing it. So they've decided to transition this space between the house to a planting bed. And that's an excellent opportunity to put some xeric plants in and some low water plants and go ahead and transition that turf or that grass overhead irrigation zone to a drip irrigation zone. We want to use drip irrigation in plant beds where we have flowers, ornamental grasses, or shrubs. But the thing I want to caution you on is do not mix drip and overhead irrigation on the same zone. So this area over here would be useful to have drip irrigation, and then go ahead and use that overhead irrigation on the lawn. Don't try to water drip irrigation and the lawn on the same zone, because we learned that they have such different precipitation rates. Again, overhead's being measured in gallons per minute. This drip irrigation system is being measured in gallons per hour. So scheduling becomes extremely difficult. We want to use drip irrigation if you have planting beds with extremely tall plants that will obstruct that overhead irrigation. So if you have a planting bed that has plants that are 24 inches or taller, it's really difficult to properly irrigate those areas with overhead irrigation and irrigate that area efficiently. So it's recommended to use that drip irrigation if you have a planting bed where you have maybe it's a tall ornamental grass right here, or have you that tall shrub. If you have pop-ups, it's really hard to irrigate this area efficiently if we're having that obstruction from these tall plants. This area here, so where to use drip irrigation, maybe it's in this looks like a terraced area behind a retaining wall. Maybe that planting bed space is 3 feet or less. So it's extremely difficult to irrigate that with overhead irrigation. So this would be an excellent opportunity to use drip irrigation, and it would also be an excellent opportunity because of the height of these plants. If you had pop-up head here or overhead irrigation, this rusting stage would likely block or obstruct that spray pattern, making it very inefficient. Again, going back to those benefits of drip irrigation, so plants with different water requirements in the same area or on the same zone. So that allows you to go ahead and put an emitter for a very low water requirement plant, as well as have a plant that has moderate to high water use on that same zone. So you can have that same different water requirements on the same zone. It's extremely useful in vegetable beds or pots. So we can see here we have some drip irrigation that is going to these pots. Vegetable garden beds, it's really useful to have that drip irrigation. Very rarely do we see overhead irrigation used for vegetable beds or pots. If you're trying to irrigate a pot with overhead irrigation, the chances are that it's very inefficient. Newly planted trees, it's extremely useful. So you can see here in this picture, it looks like we have some rock mulch. They might be preparing for a new plant or a new tree here. So they're going to go ahead and use some inline drip irrigation. So this is kind of that first introduction to inline drip irrigation. The difference is it's a brown pipe and it's manufactured with emitters in that pipe. So we'll talk a little bit about that here later in the presentation. It's extremely important to remember to move or add that drip or add additional drip as the tree grows. So again, planting it at a new planting, it's nice to have that drip irrigation right at the base of the root ball. But as that tree grows and expands, it's important to add additional rings or remove that initial ring from the initial planting and expand that drip irrigation as that tree establishes and as those roots start to expand. Drip irrigation directly at a base of a mature tree is very limited in its effectiveness, just because as trees become mature, that rooting system is so expansive that if you're having drip irrigation right at the base or the trunk of the tree, the likelihood of that water being put to beneficial use, that those tree roots are so expansive that it's getting water from the drip line of the tree and extended. So when not to use drip irrigation. So obviously we don't want to use drip irrigation for a lawn or a grass area. If you want to have a solid ground cover area, I wouldn't recommend using drip irrigation. Again, going back to the very large or mature trees, it's not recommended because their root systems are so expansive. And the narrow borders just adjacent. So here's the mature tree. We wouldn't want to have drip irrigation right here at the base of that tree. We might want to have that irrigation here extending from the drip line of the tree out. And the likelihood is that this large mature tree is obtaining that water from the lawn area. For narrow borders that are directly adjacent to a lawn, if you don't already have drip irrigation here in this border, it's probably not a big deal because there's probably some residual or overspray that's achieving that water for these plants from the overhead spray irrigation system from the lawn. Okay, so we'll dive right into drip irrigation equipment now that we've learned a little bit about what a drip irrigation system is, the benefits of that drip irrigation system, some ideal places and scenarios to use that drip and where not to use the drip. So drip irrigation equipment, the specifications vary greatly between manufacturers. And what I mean by that is when you're talking about fittings and pipe volume, the allowance for that pipe volume, emitters, it's best to pick one manufacturer and stick with it. So again, inside and outside diameters of pipe can vary. So that means fittings may not fit correctly. If it's an insert fitting, if it's a compression fitting, you really got to make sure that the inside and outside diameters of those pipes are the same for the product that you're using. So the biggest recommendation is to pick a manufacturer and stick with it. So one of the main components of a drip irrigation system is a pressure reducer and a filter. So drip irrigation is a low volume or low pressure and a low volume irrigation system. So we want to really dial that pressure back for that zone from anywhere to 20 to 45 psi. These filters are going to filter out any small particles in that drip irrigation system from clogging those emitters. This device here is a filter and pressure reducer that are built in to the same product. In the past, we've had a filter, and then on the other side, we've had a pressure reducer. But now they're starting to manufacture these components that are built into the same product. We want to make sure that you're putting that pressure reducer and that filter in some sort of valve box. This is a small round valve box. It doesn't have to be a round box. It can be a rectangle box. We want to make sure you put that into a valve box. That way it's accessible to clean the filter or to do any maintenance on that component. That pressure reducer is going to prevent emitters from potentially popping off. Point source drip pipe is generally installed in a 1/2 inch or 3/4 inch drip pipe, and it's generally a black pipe. This pipe will meander or weave through the planting beds near the plants or directly at the base of the plants. If it's not directly at the base of the plant, that's okay. There's another product here that you can see, which is called distribution tubing, that can be strung directly to the base of the plant. You want to use fabric pins to hold this drip irrigation in place. And again, going back to this 1/4 inch tubing, you want to kind of limit the distance of that tubing that is being strung to the plants. The general recommendation is 12 inches or less. And that's a 1/4 inch that directly connects directly to that emitter, which is this red component that it has a barbed end that is punctured directly into the side of the pipe. So we have pressure compensating emitters. We have red emitters here on this drip line. So again, we have that 1/4 inch tubing being distributing that water directly to the base of these plants or these shrubs. It's going to slowly drip that water at the base of the plant. They're color coded. So we have this blue color code here. It's hard to see, but once you get familiar with this product, it's color coded for the ease to understand how much water or how many gallons per hour that emitter is producing. So a blue emitter is producing a 1/2 gallon per hour. A black emitter is producing 1 gallon per hour, and a red emitter is putting out 2 gallons per hour. So again, going back to the manufacturer and sticking with it, this manufacturer has this color coding system. Another manufacturer may have another coding system. So it's best, again, going back to that, it's really best and it's most beneficial to stick to one manufacturer and work with that same manufacturer as you either install a new drip irrigation zone or you retrofit a drip irrigation zone. You want to make sure you're sticking with the same manufacturer. That way you're not getting crossed up and thinking that you're applying a 1/2 gallon with a blue emitter, but another manufacturer has a blue emitter that's applying 2 gallons per hour. So just make sure you stick with those manufacturers. Point source drip is best for less densely planted areas. So if it's a sparsely planted area or shrubs, that's really where point source drip irrigation comes into play with these different emitters. This is also where we start to be able to apply different amounts of water within the same zone to plants that have different water needs. So that's if you have a plant that is a low water need plant, you can go ahead and put a 1/2 gallon emitter on that plant. But on the same zone, you might have a shrub that requires that 2 gallons per hour. So you can put a red emitter that's producing that 2 gallons per hour for that shrub that might have a little bit higher water need than a very low water needing plant. So drip irrigation equipment. So this is the inline drip pipe. It's generally brown in color. However, there is some 1/4 inch distribution tubing that is also has this inline drip components to it that can be black or brown, but for the most part, it's a brown pipe and it's called inline drip. A lot of times folks will call this netafim pipe. It is another term that's used. The black pipe is used as a supply header. So what that means is this black pipe here is our supply for our water source, and we have a fitting here that's connected to our water source where we start to apply this water from the supply through the brown netafim pipe to begin to use that brown netafim as a drip emitter. It's generally applied in a grid-like pattern, and the idea is to kind of evenly wet the entire area for a more densely planted planting bed or vegetable garden. This pipe is held in place by fabric pins, and it's really recommended to use an adequate amount of fabric pins just to keep this drip irrigation pipe really pinned down to the top of the soil surface so it doesn't start to pop up above the mulch. So here's another example. We looked at this one earlier, but I just wanted to again kind of drive home this evenly spaced grid pattern where we're going to kind of evenly wet this densely planted perennial bed. So the inline drip emitters are manufactured directly into the pipe versus the point source emitters, or we have to take and puncture into the pipe. They're spaced at even intervals. So some of the specifications are these emitters are spaced every 12 inches or 18 inches or 24 inches. Again, it's measured in gallons per hour, but we might be applying 1/4 of a gallon per hour, 4/10 of a gallon per hour, 6/10 of a gallon per hour, or 9/10 of a gallon per hour. So there's a little bit of selection that you have to do and understand when you're selecting inline drip. You just want to make sure that you have the spacing selected as well as the emitter size. So again, it's best used for densely planted areas. So this is an example of versus the grid pattern that you saw in our previous example. You can see this brown netafim pipe that's kind of evenly woven or meandered through our planting bed here at the demonstration garden. But this is a more densely planted area where we're going to try to evenly apply that water throughout this area. You've heard me talk about drip fittings a little bit, but here is an example. Our picture on the right-hand side here is a barbed fitting, and there are also compression fittings. So barbed fitting is going to use the inside diameter of a pipe, and it's going to be pushed into the pipe, and you have to use a pinch clamp to seal that barbed fitting to make sure that it's not pushing off of these barbs and producing a leak. A compression fitting is it uses the outside diameter, and you just push that pipe into this compression fitting and no clamps are required. Both are great options. It's a personal preference for these fittings. That's used to connect polyurethane pipe, or what the more common term is poly pipe. So some of the fittings terminology you'll hear is a T, which is an example of this, an elbow. They have straight calipers for repairs, and then drain caps. You really want to make sure you utilize those drain caps at the end of each one of your drip irrigation runs or your end of the pipe. That way you can go ahead and take that cap off and flush that irrigation zone if you have a lot of debris that has entered that line from a potential break. One of the biggest benefits of drip irrigation is no glue is required. So again, we can use those barb fittings or the compression fittings. And this is an example of that pinch clamp that you put on that pipe, and you go ahead and use a pinch clamp or a clamp tool to squeeze around that pipe to make sure that it's going to stay on that fitting. So here's a quick example of those fittings in use. So you can see here we have that barbed T, where we're connecting at an intersection of 3 pipes. I have one pipe coming from this direction, another pipe coming from the left, and we have this pipe extending outward. So we've used a T here, and we've used these clamps, and we've clamped around that barb fitting. I like to move these clamps as close to the very last barb as I can, just to make sure that this pipe is going to definitely stay on that barbed fitting. Here's a compression fitting in use. This is a straight coupler. This might have been an area where we had damage in our drip line, so we've used a compression fitting to make that repair on this straight run. Here is another example of a straight coupler repair with a barbed fitting, and again, we've used those pinch clamps to make sure that this drip line is going to stay on that barbed fitting. But you can see that the barbed fitting is going on the inside of the pipe versus the compression fitting is utilizing the outside diameter going on the outside of the pipe. So some additional drip irrigation equipment. So again, talking about this 1/4-inch distribution tubing, here's a roll of it where we're going to cut 12-inch lengths that are going to extend directly to the base of the plant for point source drip. We have our 1/4-inch fittings for connecting a 1/4-inch drip tubing. So these are straight, kind of a similar fashion as those barbed fittings, but this is an unregulated fitting that we can connect at straight angles. We can maybe use a T 1/4-inch fitting, or a elbow, a 90 degrees fitting to connect this 1/4-inch tubing. This purple device here is an insert tool to insert these emitters. So you would put that emitter into this purple tool here, and this tool is an assistant to help puncture that emitter directly into that pipe. You might need some stakes to put this 1/4-inch tubing directly into the ground, or so we can prop it up just a little bit so it can go ahead and drip at the base of the plant. Here is an example of those fabric pins that we're going to go ahead and use to keep the 1/2-inch or the 3/4-inch piping in place, or even this 1/4-inch distribution tubing. We can use those sod staples or these stakes to keep in place, or the fabric pins. We have the cutting tool. So this is a poly pipe cutting tool that can cut anywhere from 1 inch all the way down to a 1/4-inch poly pipe. So this will cut that pipe. If you don't have this tool, just a regular razor blade will work. If you have a really nice set of scissors, that can also work for a 1/2-inch poly pipe. So that's used to make any repairs or make any, utilizing those fittings. And then here is a picture of that pinch clamp tool to go ahead and crimp or pinch that clamp around those barbed insert fittings. So connecting to the water source, there's really 3 scenarios that are at play here. Either it's part of an initial installation, so this is what it would look like for an initial installation. This valve is designed for drip irrigation, but also, again, we have this filter here that has that built-in pressure reducer and filter. So that's going to come directly out of the valve, and then we'll have a fitting here that is threaded that connects to our, whether we're using a 1/2-inch or 3/4-inch drip pipe, and that will start to make its way onto the top of the surface. So this might be found in a valve box or a manifold. We have the retrofit option. So this is where you would really want to find the first head on the zone. And the way you do that is you turn on an irrigation system and you try to see which head is pressurized or pops up first. As soon as you find that head, what you want to do is dig that head up, find the existing, so we had an existing 1-inch lateral line, and there was likely a head that was right here at this point. And we've used a fitting. So now we've got a elbow fitting here where we extended this 1-inch poly pipe. And now we've used an adapter where we're reducing from a 1-inch down to a 1/2-inch line. Okay, so this is where we start to transition this existing overhead sprinkler zone to a drip irrigation zone. This is kind of the initial point after we've found our first head back here, right next to the sidewalk at this location. So that means once you make this cut here, all the remaining heads on the zone that might have extended along the sidewalk line are going to be abandoned, and we're going to start to transition this area to a drip irrigation zone. We'll utilize that round box again, and we're going to put that pressure regulator and filter in that round box. And again, we can use a 3/4-inch or a 1/2-inch drip pipe. That's going to start to make its way to the top of the surface, right on top of the soil, for our drip irrigation zone. Another way we can use drip irrigation is we can connect directly to a hose spigot. So you can utilize a timer, and you would utilize again, you want to make sure that you have that pressure reducer in there and that filter, and then you would start to string out or meander that half-inch drip line for your planting beds. One of the things with these timers are you have to leave this hose spigot on in order for this timer to work properly, because this timer is going to tell this system when to let the water flow beyond that point. So this hose spigot will have to be constantly left on. This also can be accomplished without the timer, and you can just simply manually turn on your hose spigot to water that drip irrigation area. So some drip system design basics. So one of these are some general rules. So the 200-200 rule is intended for half-inch pipe. And what the 200-200 rule means is do not exceed 200 feet of half-inch drip pipe on one zone, and do not exceed 200 gallons per hour. So that kind of brings us back to understanding our emitter choices and understanding how many emitters we have, what the output, what the gallons per hour output is. You want to make sure you're not exceeding that 200 gallons per hour or that 200 feet of pipe. So what this really means is for a residential setting or for a normal or a traditional or regular sized residential property, you can more than likely water all of your planting beds on one zone. However, a lot of times if it's done if this drip irrigation is installed at the initial installation phase, you might find a drip irrigation zone on the front and a drip irrigation zone on the back. If you're to choose to use 3/4 inch pipe, what that means is you don't want to exceed 480 feet of pipe, and you don't want to exceed 480 gallons per hour. So for a retrofit option, I think it's definitely doable to have all of your planting beds on your property on one zone. It's just a matter of trying to stay below that 200 feet threshold for that pipe if you're using a half-inch, and it's just a matter of trying to find a way to get that drip irrigation or that drip pipe throughout your property in a reasonable way. Sometimes there's a sidewalk or a driveway or something like that that makes it challenging to have all of your property on one drip irrigation zone. The drip system design the design, so for inline drip, it depends on the emitter spacing. So again, what you choose for your emitter spacing, what you choose for your emitter size, and what your pressure is for that irrigation zone. But the general rule of thumb is you can have anywhere from 300 to 500 feet of that pipe for one irrigation zone. So again, it's definitely reasonable to have this drip irrigation for inline drip to be on one zone for your entire property. So here's a quick look. Just wanted to quickly show you what an inline drip irrigation kind of schematic looks like. Here's that brown pipe, and here's that manufactured emitter in this pipe. And again, this is the component that is that you specify on the gallons per hour and how frequently that emitter is spaced in that pipe. Scheduling for drip irrigation is critically important. That comes, the management comes into play here, making sure that you're being efficient with that drip irrigation zone. So again, similar to overhead irrigation, you want to make sure that you're scheduling according to the season. So what this means is generally in the spring and fall, you can go ahead and schedule that drip irrigation zone one time per week for a total of 60 minutes. For the heat of the summer and the summer months for June, July, and August, depending on your plants that you have and their water need and the maturity of those plants, you can bump that irrigation for that drip zone up to 2 times per week. So schedule it for 60 minutes. But again, there's another technique to use, and it's called cycle and soak. It's very similar to traditional overhead irrigation where you split that 60 minutes into 2 different run times. So perhaps you would run that drip irrigation for 30 minutes and then take a break, maybe an hour, and then run it again for 30 minutes. But what you don't want to do is do 30 minutes in the morning and then 30 minutes at night, because it allows that soil to dry out and you're not driving that water deep for those plant roots to drive deeper and become a healthier landscape. It's recommended to check the soil moisture and adjust that runtime as needed. So making sure you understand the root depth, go ahead and take a soil moisture probe or device and check that soil moisture a day later to see if you're watering that area adequately, and adjust those run times as needed. The other tip I have for drip irrigation is it's really important to, and the best way to schedule really, and one of the only ways to schedule is drip irrigation properly, is to put drip irrigation on its own program. So what I mean by that is you want to make sure that your lawn or your grass areas are being watered on a separate program from your drip irrigation, because if drip irrigation is on the same program, that means it's running as frequently as your lawn irrigation. So if we're watering our lawn right now in the heat of the summer in June, we might be watering 3 days per week. We definitely don't want to water drip irrigation 3 days per week. So we want to make sure that we have drip irrigation on its separate program, scheduled within one of the 3 days that the lawn is being watered, to stay within that water-wise rule. But you can go ahead and schedule drip irrigation at any time of the day. So making sure that drip irrigation is on a separate program from your lawn is critically important. Thank you, everybody.